There was a wooden board, small enough for a child to carry, heavy enough to change how a child heard their own language. In some Welsh schools, if a child was caught speaking Welsh, the board was hung around their neck. To get rid of it, they had to hear another child do the same. Then they passed it on. At the end of the day, the child still wearing the board was punished. The children were doing the policing. That was how the system worked. And when you trace where that logic came from, you end up in 1847, with a government inquiry written by men who did not speak Welsh, but still felt qualified to explain why Wales was failing. Once you see that document, the word mistake becomes much harder to defend. I have seen this pattern before. A government does not always need mass violence. Sometimes it only needs a category, a report, a school, and time. The mechanism is different from the orphan trains case, where children were physically separated from families. Different from Diego Garcia, where an entire population was reclassified as temporary workers before deportation. Here, no one was moved. No one was shipped anywhere. The weapon was a piece of wood on a rope, and the soldiers were children. At first glance, this can be framed as harsh Victorian schooling. And Victorian schooling was harsh almost everywhere. Corporal punishment was a routine tool across the British system. The officials who tolerated the Welsh Not were not operating outside their era's norms. And there is a practical argument that deserves to be heard. In the mid-19th century, English was the language of law, commerce, parliament, and the empire. A Welsh child who could not speak English was shut out of most professions, most courts, most institutions. The argument for English instruction was not invented by bigots. It had real economic logic behind it. But that argument explains English instruction. It does not explain what happened to Welsh. Officials were not simply adding a language. They were treating Welsh itself as the obstacle, as something to be overcome, not preserved. And the proof is in a document that is still available, still filed, still damning. In 1847, the British Parliament commissioned a report on the state of education in Wales. 3 barristers were assigned: R.R.W. Lingen, Jelinger Symons, and Henry Vaughan Johnson. None of them spoke Welsh. None had worked in Welsh education. They spent approximately 3 months in the country, relying heavily on testimony from Anglican clergy, many of whom were hostile to the nonconformist Welsh-speaking chapels that dominated rural Welsh life. The report they produced ran to nearly 1,300 pages. Its conclusions went far beyond education. Welsh, the report stated, was a manifold barrier to the moral progress and commercial prosperity of the people. The Welsh themselves were described as ignorant, deceitful, and immoral. And the language was identified as the root cause. The commissioners were explicit. Symons wrote that the Welsh were living in an almost unintelligible language, which keeps them under the hatches. Lingen went further. He described Welsh women as lacking in chastity. This judgment was not based on evidence. It was based on gossip, collected from informants who spoke a different language and attended a different church. The report did not merely assess education. It passed moral judgment on an entire people, in a language the judges could not read. The Welsh named this report Brad y Llyfrau Gleision, the treachery of the Blue Books. It is still called that, nearly 180 years later. A government report, written without local expertise, concluded that a language spoken for over 1,000 years was the source of its speakers' poverty. And here is what that conclusion set in motion. Because the Blue Books did not just describe a problem, they shaped the system that was supposed to fix it. Now, I need to be precise here, because this is where the story is often told too simply. No single law ordered every school in Wales to use the Welsh Not. That matters, and we should be exact about it. But precision does not make the story smaller. It makes it clearer. The Committee of Council on Education, the body that controlled government grants for schools across Wales, increasingly treated English attainment as the core marker of educational success. Inspectors visited schools. They assessed English competency. English attainment increasingly became central to how success was measured and rewarded, which put clear pressure on schools to prioritize English over Welsh. No law had to say, punish Welsh. The system only had to reward English, inspect for English, and measure success in English. After that, the board barely needed instructions. But the board was not an abstraction. It landed on specific necks. And one of those necks belonged to a boy who would one day be in a position to fight back. In 1906, a man named Owen Morgan Edwards published an autobiography called Clich ad Gof, Bells of Remembrance. In it, he described his childhood in the village of Llanuwchllyn, near Bala, in the 1860s. The village was entirely Welsh-speaking. Everyone, parents, neighbors, shopkeepers, the minister, spoke Welsh. It was not a bilingual place. Welsh was not a heritage language there. It was the only language. But in school, Welsh was the language that brought punishment. Edwards wrote that the Welsh not usually found itself round my neck. He does not elaborate on the beatings. He does not describe the weight of the wood or the texture of the rope. He mentions it almost in passing, the way you mention something that happened so regularly it stopped feeling remarkable. A fact of school life, like chalk dust or cold mornings. Think about that for a moment. A child in a Welsh-speaking village, surrounded by Welsh-speaking people, punished for speaking the only language he knew, so often that it became unremarkable. But what makes his testimony impossible to set aside is what happened next. In 1907, Owen Morgan Edwards was appointed the first Chief Inspector of Schools for Wales. He spent the rest of his career working to restore the language that his own school had punished him for speaking. He promoted Welsh language instruction, Welsh history, Welsh culture, everything the Blue Books had called an obstacle. The boy who wore the board became the man who tried to undo the system that created it. But by the time he had the authority, the damage was already being measured, and the numbers are difficult to argue with. The 1891 census, the first British census to include a language question for Wales, recorded 910,289 Welsh speakers. That was 54.4% of the population. By 1901, the proportion had fallen below 50%. The historical geographer W.T.R. Price mapped Welsh language use across North Wales, parish by parish, from 1750 to 1900. His research, published in the Bulletin of the Board of Celtic Studies, showed that the decline was not gradual, the kind you would expect from immigration or industrialization alone. It was concentrated, geographically specific. Sharpest in areas where British schools operating under the post-1847 framework were most dense. Industry and migration mattered, but schooling helps explain why the decline was so sharp in some places and why it reached so deeply into the next generation. The revival happened. I want to acknowledge that. Welsh today is a recognized official language of Wales. Welsh medium education has grown substantially since the 1990s. The 1993 Welsh Language Act, passed 146 years after the Blue Books, gave the language formal legal protection. People who point to this as a success story are not wrong. The reversal was fought for and won. But the revival cannot give back what was lost between generations. And what was lost did not disappear when the schools closed. Testimonies and family accounts collected across the 20th century describe the same pattern, separated by decades and miles. A grandparent who spoke Welsh at home but refused to speak it in public. A mother who sang hymns in Welsh but switched to English the moment anyone outside the family could hear. In one family account, a woman described visiting her grandmother in the 1960s. The old woman would speak Welsh freely at home, but the moment they stepped outside, to the shop, to the post office, she switched to English. Even in a village where everyone spoke Welsh. Even when no one was listening. The school had been closed for decades, but the board was still doing its work. Not because anyone passed a law in their lifetime, because a lesson, taught by a piece of wood, outlived the schools that used it. The chain does not snap all at once. It frays. A grandparent who speaks the language, a middle generation that understands it but flinches, a youngest generation that never learned, not out of choice, but because the shame arrived before the words did. Not the language itself was lost, the confidence to pass it on. Owen Morgan Edwards fought that inheritance from inside the system. He had seen both sides, the board and the inspector's desk. He understood the mechanism better than anyone alive. And still, by the time he died in 1920, the percentage of Welsh speakers was lower than when he had started. That is the weight of what the Welsh Not accomplished. Not just punishment, an inheritance of silence. Watch the sequence. 1847. The Blue Books declare Welsh a moral and intellectual obstacle. Government inspection and funding increasingly reward English attainment. The Welsh Not spreads through schools as an unofficial but structurally incentivized tool. 1870. Compulsory schooling is established across England and Wales. Welsh is not mentioned. English is implicitly standard. By 1891, the first census language question records Welsh speakers at 54% and declining. 1993. The Welsh Language Act grants Welsh legal protection, 146 years after the report that called it a liability. Not every change can be blamed on schools alone. Migration, industry, and economics mattered too. But the sequence shows that state-backed education policy pushed powerfully in one direction. Today, the Welsh Not survives less as a classroom object than as a symbol, preserved in museums, retold in memoirs, histories, and family accounts across more than a century. But Owen Morgan Edwards wrote about the board in 1906, and the pattern he described, the casual regularity of punishment for speaking your own language in your own country, did not end when the last school stopped using it. You do not need to ban a language. You do not need to outlaw a culture. You need a child to believe that part of themselves is a liability. Once that belief is in place, the system runs itself. That is the operating manual. If your family comes from Wales, if your grandparents or great-grandparents attended schools where Welsh was punished, I want to know what was passed down: the language, the silence, or both. What comes next starts underground. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, there is a town the government tried to erase, not through paperwork, not through a board around a child's neck, but through a fire that has been burning since 1962. The pattern continues. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.